Welcome to Buffering. This week, we're thrilled to have Jeff Johnston, lead economist from CoBank, join us. Jeff leads economic research for the digital infrastructure division and brings a unique perspective on rural broadband data centers and the evolving role of AI in our industry. Welcome to Buffering, Jeff.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. It's Happy New Year. It's great to be on.
Great to have you on. And we can jump right into our conversation here today. But I want to talk a little bit about your role with CoBank here, who is a major lender to electric cooperatives, broadband operators, as I mentioned, and even data center developers as well. So you really do kind of have that front row seat to the changes happening here in America.
Yeah, we absolutely do. It's a great time to be at CoBank. I think it's always a good time to be at CoBank. It truly is a great organization. But more specifically, even in today's climate, as you mentioned, Zach, there's a lot going on around data centers and the impact that data centers are having on the energy complex, and then the impact that they're having on the broadband complex. And so the cool thing about working at CoBank is we've got a pretty broad view of all that because we finance energy companies, electric distributors and generation and transmission companies. And we work with and finance the developers, as you mentioned, and then also the rural broadband operators. And because, rural America in this kind of new phase of technology and AI that we're in right now, I really think rural America is taking center stage. So it's a great time to be at CoBank and love sharing knowledge and helping people, hopefully make a good decision.
That's awesome. Yeah, and we're excited to get into that conversation around rural and AI and how these things are coming together. You've written some really interesting articles about that topic specifically. But before we get too deep into the conversation today, Jeff, I want to do a little bit of a throwback to, I think, a very interesting project. As we were doing some research for this podcast, I noticed that about 20 years ago, you were on the team that developed the ESPN mobile phone. And I feel like the ESPN phone always gets brought up in the discussion of quote unquote product failures, but I think that's very unfair. I'd love to hear your perspective as somebody who was in the middle of that project and, worked on that launch. Like what's your perspective having worked through all of that and been in the, kind of right in the middle of all of it?
Yeah, I mean, that is a throwback. I love it. I've been around a while, so I've done some fun things. So
hey,
yeah,
I'm old enough to
talk
remember
about
the ESPN phone too, man. It was a big deal when it came out.
Yeah, no, it was fun. It was an exciting time in my career. And, when I think about that business, we actually pulled the plug on that business a lot faster than we otherwise would have. So fun fact for you guys. Shortly after we launched the business, Steve Jobs joined the board of the Walt Disney Company. And for those who aren't familiar, the Walt Disney Company owns ESPN. And he joined the board of the Walt Disney Company by way of Disney's acquisition of Pixar. And Steve Jobs was a major shareholder in Pixar. So he therefore got a board seat on the Walt Disney Company. So probably sometime, if I had to guess, sometime around mid 2006, call it a few months into launch, Steve Jobs picked up the phone and he called the then president of ESPN and said, "What are you guys doing? I mean, this MVNO, this little flip phone that you're trying to serve up data on is just not a good idea. So you should probably shut this business down." And of course, Steve had a lot of influence because of who he was on technology and business. So
maybe some
I think
saltier language thrown into that conversation too. Then
oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. So we shut it down. I think it was in August of 2006, and then of course, as we all know, in January of 2007. He introduced the iPhone. So he knew what was coming. So he actually, we probably saved a lot of money in marketing and other things to try and get that business off the ground, because I'm not so sure it would have ultimately worked because of the iPhone. But, as I also reflect back on that time, back then, having a wide range of devices in your portfolio as an operator, like having like a good, better, best lineup of phones was really important to customers. And, as a smaller MVNO, we didn't have the buying power to be able to have a broad portfolio of products. So that was a challenge. And then the economics were a lot different back then for MVNOs as they are today. So, back then there wasn't a lot of Wi-Fi offloading or any really Wi-Fi offloading. So all the data that your end user customers were consuming, you were paying for. You were paying your host operator. And that made the economics challenging. And back then people just really wanted, buckets of minutes on the cheap and didn't really appreciate the fully immersive customization sports experience that we thought customers would. And then lastly, I would say, again, just thinking back to that, from a distribution standpoint, that was also a challenge because, back then we had national retailers like Circuit City, who have since gone out of business, and Best Buy, who's still around, and Radio Shack, who has gone out of business. They were really important distribution partners for operators back then. And we struggled with that. And people weren't buying things online back then like they are today.
Hmm.
So kind of a combination of all that stuff ultimately led to our demise. But you learn a lot more from your failures in life than you do from your successes. So it was a good learning experience and certainly a fun time to be in wireless.
Well, and frankly, that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask you about it, because it does feel like one of those things where you probably learned a ton from that experience, even though it was considered a failure. I do think I've always heard this. I've always heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but a lot of that technology ended up being forklifted into what became the ESPN app and everything that really built out ESPN as a mobile app provider on the App Store once the iPhone did launch. So not necessarily wasted effort, just shifting business model as things move to a different place.
Yeah, Gabe, that's a really good point. No doubt about it. That was a launching pad. I mean, what we were doing back then with the app, and we were really pushing the phone to its limits. I mean, we didn't have the memory, we didn't have the processing power in those phones. So we had to get really creative to make sure that we could deliver what at the time was pretty unique and pretty revolutionary, actually, data experience on a mobile phone. We really pushed the limits of the device. And then, as you mentioned, then that was sort of the launching pad for, really fully embracing digital, content. And then it was set up very nicely when the App Store launched with the iPhone and so
Hmm.
on and so forth. So yeah, for sure.
I'm also cracking
Well,
up just
thanks.
thinking of Zach. I don't know, Zach, have you ever been in a Circuit City or a Radio Shack? I don't know if I've ever told you this, but I actually worked at Radio Shack when I was in high school
I
selling
think you
cell
did
phones.
mention that. But Gabe, the big takeaway here was thanks to this podcast, I learned that ESPN had developed a phone or had the NVNO. So that was new to me as well. But I obviously was not buying phones in 2006, 2005. But
Yeah, it probably wasn't on
as
your
a
list.
natural transition here, let's talk a little bit about AI now. And Jeff, Gabe talked about some of your past articles here at the top of the podcast here. And I would love some of your thoughts here on AI and the shift from learning to inference as well. So we can kind of start there, but can you kind of walk us through this difference between learning and inference and why this matters for data center placement?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we're going from, flip phones to AI. I love it. We're bouncing around here. It's
We
good
just jumped
stuff.
like 2 decades.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, no, yeah. So I guess the way I think about it, guys, when I think about AI from an infrastructure perspective and from a data center location perspective, as you mentioned, AI and learning and inference, I really think about it in those two buckets. So the way I think about it is in the learning bucket, if you will. But this is where these models, whether it's ChatGPT or Gronk or whoever, are going out and they're trying to consume as much information as possible, and they're trying to develop the most deep, efficient knowledge base and architecture that they possibly can, and which serves as a foundation for inference, which is where the end user applications reside in that second bucket, and sort of take advantage or exploit all of the work that was done in the first bucket, in the learning bucket. The thing about the learning bucket, if you will, it's incredibly compute intensive and requires a lot of GPUs and a lot of energy to be able to process all of these tokens and these data points. But it's also location agnostic, right? So there's not any specific latency requirements necessarily with these particular workloads or this activity that's happening in this bucket in these data centers. Whereas on the inference side, the application side, you can see situations where applications are developed that companies are using or individuals are using that may have certain latency requirements that therefore need to be located closer to where the end user is using those applications. So when I think about this in the context of rural America, as I mentioned earlier at the onset, rural America screens out real nicely for data center operators who are building these data centers for these learning workloads because of the fact that they're not location dependent. And when you think about it, it's sort of a virtuous cycle, meaning as we use applications, as time goes on, we use more AI applications, the application is going to figure out what worked and what didn't work. The users are going to realize what they like and they didn't like, and it's going to be feeding that information back into the learning bucket. And so you got this ongoing cycle of just constant compute to improve the performance of applications and the models. So that's kind of how I think about it from a location and a technology perspective, and really why rural America is playing a really important role in a lot of what's going on in AI right now.
And with these edge data centers here, we hear a lot about, self-driving cars, the AI models they use, or even robotics. But what types of applications do you see really driving the need for these data centers being closer to these communities?
Well, I mean, boy, I mean, it's almost limitless when you think about
Hmm.
the different types of applications. I think, you mentioned self-driving cars, and I don't know that a lot of compute is going to be done real time in data centers while the car's going down the road. I'm not an expert in this, so I don't want to get too far over my skis here. But I think a lot of that compute because of the fact that if there's latency glitches and you drive off the road, that's a problem. So I think a
Yeah, that would
lot of
be
this
bad.
is going to be done in the car itself, and then once you get home, there'll be a download of data back to a data center, and there'll be some processing that's done. But I think in terms of the actual driving itself, I think a lot of that's done on board. But when you think about applications and I mean, my goodness, I think that the healthcare industry is ripe for disruption and for efficiencies for AI. And then when I think about drug development and drug research and speeding up drug development and drug research, it feels like AI could play a really critical role in that particular industry. I can't speak to applications because I'm not a scientist, but I kind of think about it more from an industry perspective in areas where I think AI could have a profound impact for efficiencies and so forth. Oh, and then, of course, you hear about coding and things like that. I think that there's an argument that these AI models can start to code and develop code where you may not need as many developers. So I think you gotta really just. I think it transcends every industry and almost transcends. Will transcend how we live, but I think the opportunities are just enormous when we think about the potential to increase productivity and efficiency, and then also increase top line revenue.
Yeah, and then kind of one more question here before I'll kick it over to Gabe to talk about using it as a broadband revenue stream here. But let's talk about electric co-ops a little bit. How have you seen electric co-ops respond to these rural communities needing this extra infrastructure?
Yeah, so this has been interesting. I'd say over the last 2 years or so, I've had the opportunity to attend and speak at a lot of electric cooperative and GNT conferences, and and also therefore had a chance to meet with a lot of managers of these businesses and leaders in the community as well as it relates to board of directors for a lot of these folks. And so it's been an interesting sort of journey the last couple of years because when I first started talking to folks and trying to educate them on what was happening and what we were seeing at CoBank, understandably so, we're hearing a lot of people saying, "Geez, I don't know you guys. I mean, this sounds really risky. I mean, you're asking me as a co-op manager to step into a deal with a hyperscaler that's going to double my load." And so that's a lot of concentration risk from a manager's perspective with just one customer. So you think about it from that perspective, and then you think about it from the standpoint that, these managers they haven't been in a growth industry, right? I mean, yes, we're doing a lot more over the last 20, 25 years electronically or digitally. So you would therefore think that the net impact on the energy complex is that we've actually the increase of electrons have gone up, but they haven't. They've been flat because of efficiencies and technologies and so forth. So they really haven't been in a growth environment. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they got to double their load. So that was very concerning to managers and to board of director members because of the risk to the communities and the uncertainty. And this is kind of getting out of our comfort zone. And then so there's that, and look, Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, and Google, these are huge companies, and they're used to being able to dictate terms with their suppliers because they're so big and they have so much leverage. So I think early on, these hyperscalers were coming into these communities and thought that they could kind of dictate terms to these electric cooperatives. But they quickly realized that that's not the way it works in this industry, these electric cooperatives don't need hyperscalers necessarily and weren't willing to take on a lot of risk, capital risk and concentration risk. So I guess early on in my journey with these folks, there was a lot of pushback from these community members saying, not in my backyard. I don't want to deal with this. Forget it. So fast forward to today or more recently, and what we're starting to see now, and I'm being very general because I know there's a lot of reports in the media about communities pushing back on data centers today. And that's true. That's true. So I'm being very general in my comments here based on my anecdotal feedback. But the sense that I'm getting now is that the hyperscalers realize that in order for them to deploy these data centers in these rural communities or smaller communities, they need to start to reduce a lot of the friction and the concerns that these communities have in terms of energy generation and the sustainability of these investments and so forth. And so they've heard that message loud and clear. And these folks are now coming to these communities and saying, okay, what do we need to do? Do we need to pay for all of the energy generation that we're going to use? Done. No problem. Do we need to invest in your schools? Actually, they want to do that because they want the community to thrive, right? They want to make sure that there's a thriving base of people graduating from school and going on to college that can come back and work in these data centers. No problem. We'll invest in that. We'll invest in nonprofits. We'll invest in water infrastructure. Well, they really want to kind of land and expand in these communities and try and address a lot of the friction and concerns that communities have around these data center operators. So my sense is that folks are starting to warm up to this a little bit more and seem to be more open and recognize the profound economic opportunity that does exist for these communities when a data center operator comes to town. I would say there's a lot more success stories out there than there are failures. And I think people are starting to realize that.
Well, and that leads us nicely into this next section that we wanted to talk about, Jeff, which is this whole theme of how can broadband operators specifically, and we work with a lot of broadband service providers as well as a lot of electric cooperatives who have expanded into broadband. How can they leverage these broader themes to expand into new revenue streams? So from your perspective in these conversations that you're having, I'd love to understand, what are some of these business lines or opportunities that you see for broadband service providers as this AI infrastructure grows? And it sounds like as the communities get a little bit more open to these types of things happening in the areas that they are.
Yeah, I think, Gabe, it's a really exciting time for rural broadband operators as it relates to AI data center deployments. And if I had to say one thing right off the bat, I would encourage rural broadband operators to stay very close in communication and contact with their electric distributors in their communities, their co-op electric distributors, because the reality is those are the folks that are getting the first call, right? Because power is the bottleneck here. The industry has realized that it's a lot easier to move gigabits of data than it is electrons. So power is the bottleneck, and that's been well documented. So those are the folks that are getting the call first. And so just as a general guide, staying close to those folks and understanding, hey, are you getting calls from developers or are you getting calls from hyperscalers looking at building in our community? And if so, it's kind of so that's sort of a lead that you can take advantage of to support that if it ends up coming to town. So that's one comment I would make. And then the other thing I think to recognize is that speed is of the utmost importance for these data center for these developers and these hyperscalers. I mean, they're all in this race, whether it's a race against each other, meaning It's a race against Google and Amazon or Microsoft and Meta. I mean, however you want to look at it, there's races between the hyperscalers. And then there's this geopolitical stuff as well that's going on, that we are in the US in a race against China. So everyone's trying to build infrastructure as fast as they possibly can. And from what I've heard, oftentimes what hyperscalers would rather do from a speed standpoint is they would rather partner with a local broadband operator who has context locally for labor, who understands the market, who can get stuff permitted very quickly. It could just execute faster than if a hyperscaler decided to build their own fiber connectivity, which happens. I mean, it happens. So recognizing that, I think, is also very important. And then lastly, I mean, these data centers require a lot of fiber redundancy. So it's a
Mm.
pretty big opportunity. And it's not just one connection. They require a lot of redundancies. I think there's kind of recognizing all of that and positioning yourself closely with the electric distributors, hopefully could result in some nice upside, because I think it could be pretty significant.
Yeah, I agree, and it's been interesting seeing this, and over the last 6 to 9 months or whatever. It's the thing that I keep coming back to is, these broadband service providers, fiber providers specifically, have been building these low latency fiber, really fast networks for years now, right? And they've got all of this infrastructure, and it seems really primed to be able to leverage for a lot of the use cases and examples that we've been talking about today. So I'm so with you. It seems like such a fantastic opportunity of these two things kind of coming together at the same time, of this massive fiber infrastructure investments that have been happening over the last decade, and now this massive increase in everything that's happening from an AI perspective.
Yeah, no, for sure, Gabe. And when you look back at COVID, and what we learned is how much operating leverage these networks have. There was a surge in data traffic, obviously, with everybody working from home and shopping from home. And these networks had no problem handling,
Yep.
that surge in data traffic. So I
It's a
agree
great
that
point.
all these investments are really well positioned to support the surge in AI data traffic that is here and will only get bigger.
I know we want to talk about, we've got one other topic we want to go through, but before we jump off to that one, we've talked about some of the opportunities here. What are some of the challenges potentially that you foresee for providers, with these competitive situations coming in, with these hyperscalers coming in? What are some of the potential pitfalls that you see for folks?
I think it's you need to be aware of who the counterparty is,
Mm,
right? So meaning that it's a bit of a land grab out there right now, from a developer standpoint, and you've got some bad actors out there, right? That are just shopping power, meaning that they're just going around and they're trying to secure as much electron as they can, or as much capacity as they can, claiming that they have a hyperscaler in their back pocket, or claiming that they've got to deal with a hyperscaler and they're representing on their behalf. And then in reality, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just going around and trying to secure power. And then once they get that done, then they go to the hyperscalers and say, hey, by the way, I've been able to get access to all of this, the X amount of gigawatts or megawatts of energy. You should look at, partnering with me and coming over here. You don't want to deal with those folks from an energy perspective. And then you want to be careful from a broadband perspective as well, regarding, you know, watching out for those kinds of folks, because you could end up wasting a lot of time and money and effort on something that may never ever come to fruition. So kind of there's that. But honestly, I mean, once if you're working with a reputable company and that's representing hyperscalers, or you're working with the hyperscalers themselves, I mean, these are nothing's, bulletproof, but, these are long life assets. I mean, I think that these hyperscalers are probably looking at 30, 40, 50 years kind of thing. I mean, I'd just be really hard pressed for any significant market churn. Like, I'd be really hard pressed to see these hyperscalers say, you know what? I don't really like it over here. These huge data centers I've built, I'm going to go somewhere else. The cost to do that is so significant. So therefore these exit barriers are really high. So, it feels like, again, it's not bulletproof, but I think if you can partner with one of these reputable firms or the hyperscalers themselves and get this business, I think you're in really good shape for a really long time. But just watch out for the cowboys out there.
Speaking of considerable cost here, I want to talk a little bit about LEO, low Earth orbit, and the fiber debate. And I think this is a debate that Gabe and I can say is definitely increasing, certainly increasing here in 2025, 2026. And you recently wrote an article here that had a point about LEO providers being good enough, and I want to kind of talk about that. Can you explain this good enough concept as it relates to LEO and fiber?
Yeah, for sure, Zach. So, I had an old consumer electronics friend of mine who was a executive in the industry, and I love this quote, and I'll never forget it. He told me, he said, "Jeff, there's no such thing as a bad product. The only thing is there's a bad price." That's always kind of stuck with me. And when I think about that comment in the context of connectivity, LEO versus fiber, and then maybe even what we've learned so far as it relates to fixed wireless versus fiber, I think that comment holds true here as well. And so yeah, look, LEO satellites from a latency perspective, from a performance perspective, is not as good as fiber, but it offers a lot of other things, right? It offers a lot of mobility and flexibility and so forth, and that's really what's driving the growth in those networks. I think just to be more specific, the good enough comment that I was referring to in my in my article right now is really more related to fixed wireless because again, we know fixed wireless isn't as good as fiber, but at the right price, bundled with smartphones, what we're clearly beginning to see is a lot of people gravitating towards that, and the value proposition in that good enough network connectivity with a good price is certainly resonating with people, and I guess I would kind of compare it to what we saw in the mobile industry early on related to the landline industry, right? So we know, I mean, well, for those of you who have ever used a landline phone, and some of them maybe haven't, but landline voice quality is way better than wireless. And it was significantly better than it was back in 2000, the early 2000s. But yet what we started to see was significant share erosion with landline operators to mobile because of the flexibility and the fact that that flexibility is great. And yeah, I know the quality isn't as good, but look what I can do with this. And it's a great price. And we started to see, as we all well know, landline erosion. And I think the risk here as we look ahead with fixed wireless and then LEO satellites, more specifically Amazon, because I think Amazon can come to market with a very compelling value proposition for consumers with their LEO satellite service. I mean, bundling think about bundling Amazon Leo service with Amazon Prime at some heavy discount, kind of like what they did with Prime Video. And that could be a really compelling value proposition that the Amazon Leo connectivity might be not as good as my fiber broadband, but oh my God, look what else I get, right? I get Amazon Prime Video, I get home delivery, and as we all know, everything that comes along with Amazon. So yeah, that good enough comment bundled with the right value proposition, I think could be pretty disruptive to incumbent technologies that on their own are much better.
Yeah, and you kind of alluded to this too with the mobility here, even bundling, the service with Amazon. But if fiber is technically better, as we know, what might push customers to try things like Amazon Leo or these other fixed wireless providers?
I think, I mean, look, I'm very bullish on the smartphone broadband bundle. I kind of call that the new killer bundle. The wireless operators love it because they don't have to subsidize an iPhone to the tune of $1,000 or so, and the churn for customers who take for example, a Verizon 5G home service along with a Verizon mobile service, that customer churn is a lot lower than those customers who just take their smartphone service. So they love this for a variety of reasons, and of course, it uses any excess capacity that they have in their network, which is great from a utilization standpoint. Because of all of those benefits to the wireless operators, we're seeing they're getting very aggressive on price. And so I think what would make somebody switch is price. I mean, and to a large degree is going to be price for fixed wireless in particular from fiber. And then, as I just alluded to before too, with Again, not so much Starlink because I don't really know what they could bundle yet. Maybe they'll come up with some new bundles, but certainly as it relates to Amazon, I mean, I think they could put together a very compelling value proposition that could be very disruptive to broadband operators with all the bats and balls that they have to play with. And I would mention too, and this, I don't think this got a lot of attention last year when Amazon announced it, but they said they're going to invest $4 billion into rural America to increase Amazon Prime infrastructure. So this means Amazon Prime delivery. They're going to hire more people. So clearly, rural America is an area of focus, a growth area of focus for Amazon as it relates to Prime, and that dovetails nicely in with the LEO satellite service. And then lastly, I would say when you think about Amazon, this is the important thing. When you think about Amazon's overall sort of business strategic imperatives, if you will, is really two things, in my opinion. It's driving Amazon Prime subscription. They want to continue to increase that as much as possible, and they want to grow their AWS, Amazon Web Services business. That's what they're really focused on. And I think their Leo business could be a really nice tool for them to grow their Prime service.
I thought that announcement last year about that large investment they were making in rural was quite interesting. And like you said, being able to, have next day delivery, even if you're living in a rural area, and those sorts of things really start to increase the value prop of Prime. And then you're so right about just the ease of bundling all of that together. And frankly, just the marketing machine that Amazon
Yeah.
is. They're just an absolute behemoth when it comes to that. I always think about the Jeff Bezos quote, your margin is my opportunity. And it's something that I just screams to me. The margin that exists in the broadband space right now is the opportunity that, the leadership at Amazon would be looking at as a way for them to, get more aggressively into that space.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you, Gabe, and I would just add one more thing. I mean, we don't know where this is ultimately going to go, right?
For
But I
sure.
think what is a fairly safe bet based on history is that LEO satellite services are going to get better and they're going to get cheaper. I feel like that's going to happen.
It's already happening. I mean, we see it. You mentioned Starlink earlier too. Like Starlink is getting very aggressive in some areas where they're offering, 100 meg service for $40 a month in some locations. That's not broadly across the U.S., but you're starting to see them get much more aggressive from a pricing perspective in certain areas. Zack had found that they're opening stores. They're opening retail stores in some of these locations where they've won BEAD
Mm-hmm.
dollars. So they're, I'm with you. I don't know the bundling it. You can get a discount on your Tesla if you buy Starlink. I don't know if that's necessarily a compelling bundle, but there are some interesting things that I think they can do to ramp up the marketing investment that they would make to get in front of people, and they make it really easy to buy their product too, which is something that Zach and I have talked about before. 2 clicks on your phone with Apple Pay, and you can have that product shipped to your house.
A walk
There's
to the
something to
vending
be
machine
said.
too, Gabe.
That's right. I forgot about the vending machine.
The
Yeah, there's the
Starlink vending
Starlink
machines.
vending
And
machine.
here, if they can't do the Amazon Prime, Amazon Leo, I think I mentioned this on a previous episode, they're going to rely heavily on partnerships through 2026. We saw one last year with some cellular providers as well. But I think that's going to be very interesting to follow here through the new year as something like Amazon Leo launches, seeing how they go to market. I'm very interested, but not an Amazon customer, so I won't be enticed by any Leo ads this year.
It seems like there's an Amazon truck going through my neighborhood
Oh my
every
gosh.
hour. It seems like I just
Yeah,
can't
no
believe it.
doubt. Well, as we wrap this up, Jeff, we kind of talked about some of these predictions already, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on predictions for 2026 for the broadband space, for the AI space. Based on your kind of unique view of all of this, I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, for sure. So I think suffice to say, I think competition is going to intensify in the broadband market. And there's still a lot of growth in rural America, so I'm bullish there. There's still a lot of fiber that needs to be deployed, but just generally speaking, I think competition is going to become a bigger theme, and whether it's LEO or fixed wireless or or whether it's these joint ventures between what you're seeing between like T-Mobile and some of the infrastructure funds buying fiber companies and then expanding from there. whatever it is. I mean, overbuilding, you name it. I think that the competition is going to intensify in the broadband market. In the AI space, I'm not really one that's too terribly concerned about this AI bubble bursting anytime soon. I think we've got a long runway to go in terms of capital investment in this market. And because when you look at it just objectively and you ask yourself the question, is the money that Microsoft, Amazon, Google exactly, is all of this capital, and it's a surge in capital that they're deploying, is that a good use of money? Meaning, is that increasing shareholder value or is that decreasing shareholder value? And when you look at the metrics over the last 3 years, it's increasing shareholder value. So meaning that these expenditures are benefiting investors and benefiting the valuation of these companies. And then you're also seeing the margin expansion from these hyperscalers. Like I would argue that the four main hyperscalers have been deploying AI in their operations. Well, they're the first to deploy. If you think about the macro economy, they're the first to deploy AI in their operations because they're not just building AI to sell it, they're building AI to improve efficiencies and grow top line revenue. And when you look at the margin expansion across those four companies since ChatGPT was launched, I think that's a precursor to what we can expect in the broader economy. So because of those reasons, I'm very bullish on capital spending and us not hitting an AI bubble. Not to say that there's not, very localized risk areas in the market. There are, but broadly speaking, I'm pretty bullish on that as well. The one area that, of course, I'm concerned about, and many are, is just energy, right? I mean,
Mm.
are we gonna? I mean, what does that look like this year? Are we going to run out of? I mean, not going to run out of energy, but to what extent is energy? I mean, we do have a supply demand imbalance. So, how big does that imbalance grow, and what impact does that have on AI deployments? Is a big question and a big area of concern, I think, for hyperscalers and for us vis-a-vis China as well, because China is deploying electrons at an alarming rate, and we're not doing it as fast as they are, but we need to speed up. So that's an area that I'm watching closely, and hopefully we'll figure out.
All right. Well, Jeff, that's the time we had. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Guys, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast app and to share it with your friends and colleagues. And for more insights and updates, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn.